Date with a Debut is a Words and Nerds and Breathe Art Podcasts co-production recorded on a Wagbical country. And I pay my respects to all elders, past and present, and extend that to any First Nations people tuning in. Always was, always will be, Aboriginal land. On with the show.
I had no idea about this gentleman until my father was about 80 years of age. And he said his name's Chiune Sugihara. So I looked him up and discovered, whoa, how come nobody knows about this guy?
Welcome to Date with a Debut, a podcast about debut authors, their incredible books, and their journey to publication. If you are looking for a new author to discover or writing inspiration for your own story and you don't know where to start, this is the place to be. I'm Nick Wasiliev, author of When Men Cry and your host for today's show, and I'm delighted to welcome another debut author in today's episode. If you enjoy the show, or indeed any other shows on the Words and Nerds platform, jump online and give us a thumbs up, a 5-star review, wherever you are listening. Thank you for listening to us and for supporting the Australian book industry. You can also find any books mentioned in today's podcast down in the description. We're also excited to announce that Words and Nerds, including this podcast, has a special partnership with Booktopia until the 22nd of May, 2024. Order any books mentioned in this podcast down in the description from booktopia.com.au, Australia's local bookstore, and use the promo code WORDS10 at checkout to receive 10% off your order. See the description below for links and terms and conditions. Today I'm joined by Linda Margolin Royal. She's a graphic designer and copywriter, spending over 30 years in advertising in both Australia and the US. Her debut historical fiction novel, The Star on the Grave, is published by Affirm Press, which you can grab a copy of right now in the description. I started off by asking Linda about her journey to crafting the novel and also pulling from real historical figures. I feel no hesitation for us to dive straight into this amazing book that you have written, The Star on the Grave, which you just told me that you were just coming straight off the launch last night. How are we feeling?
We're feeling exhausted, adrenaline pumped, elated. It was a fantastic night, and the publisher, Affirm Press, are the most wonderful people to work for. So it was fabulously organised, and it's great. As
they should be. This book is amazing, first of all. And I feel like there's two places I want to start with here, because on top of the book itself, the story behind the creation of the book is as interesting as well. Personally, I was immediately drawn to this book when Affirm presented it to me because my father is German. And there is a lot of, routine discussion about that period of history in World War II. And your family has such an interesting, fascinating story that it could have worked as a memoir, but I'm so interested. Why were you so compelled to tell a fiction story?
I got asked exactly the same question last night at the launch. Because whilst you think that my family story is really exciting, in a lot of ways it is, but the way I wanted to write it when I was thinking about my family's story, it was actually quite boring. And so I took creative license to beef it up a bit and also to make it just a bit more, accepted by the masses, just so it would appeal to a lot more a bigger demographic, and I have a lot more conflict and intrigue because my parents were saved, which is the exciting bit, and their escape was the exciting bit. But I've set it in 1968 with a young girl's journey back to closure, and so that didn't happen, although it did happen for a lot of the survivors who discovered that Chiune Sugihara, as this young girl does, was alive, and he was discovered in 1968. So a lot of them, when they found that out, also had this desire and need to go back and thank the man to whom they owe their lives. And so I just thought that was a more interesting way of telling it. And so I created this fictional story which represented a lot of survivors.
Amazing. And again, as a disclaimer for everyone listening, this figure that you have been talking about, Japanese diplomat Chiune Sugihara, for listeners who aren't familiar, this is a real person. This is a real historical figure. Tell me a bit about him. How significant a figure is he? Because I personally had no idea about this story, which made reading this book even better.
Yes, so that's why I was compelled to write it. So I had no idea about this gentleman until my father was about 80 years of age. So I was very close to my grandmother Felka, who I've recreated pretty faithfully in the book. She was a larger-than-life, hilarious character, and that was quite common of Holocaust survivors, or I should say survivors of the Holocaust who didn't go through it but lost their entire families. They suffered trauma, which they compartmentalized, and they lived life to the fullest. So I knew nothing from her except that they escaped and that they went via Japan. Now, as a youth, I never questioned that. And then when my father told us just in passing, we decided to interview him at 80 years of age and see what his story was. And he said that this gentleman had issued them transit visas in Lithuania, which allowed them to go to Japan. Now, he was 12 years old at the time, and he remembers visiting the consul in Lithuania with his father and said this man had very kind eyes, and he was telling me all about Japan. And I said, wait a minute, who's this guy? And he said his name's Chiune Sugihara. So I looked him up and discovered, whoa, how come nobody knows about this guy? He saved 6,000 Jews from extermination, yet everybody's heard of Schindler, and I owe my life to this guy, and so do my children. Okay, I know what I want to do. I want to immortalize this guy and make him a household name, because when I started doing my research, I realized a lot of people refer to him as the Japanese Schindler, and I thought, well, why isn't Schindler referred to as the German Sugihara? So that's my aim.
I love the fact that it's a great question that you ask. And I also kind of want to add, before we actually dive into the actual book itself and the characters, you actually spoke with Chiune's surviving son, his only surviving son, leading into this book. How did it feel telling this particular story? And more to the point, has Nobuki read the book?
Yes. So when my brother, who lives in Switzerland, discovered that we had been saved by this gentleman, he said, oh, I'm sure I've met his son somewhere, because his son lives in Belgium, and somehow they crossed paths, or somebody knew somebody. And so he gave me his email address. We started corresponding, and it became clear straight away that there were a lot of survivors and descendants that were in contact with him for the same reason I wanted to be. It felt the closest thing to speaking with the man to whom we owe our lives. And so I wanted to interview him as part of my research. And I was writing the movie originally. I put the cart before the horse. And so the movie had been in development already for a few years. And in May of 2019, when I started talking to him, he said, well, I'm going across to New York. Is there any chance you're going? And I said, well, I can make a trip. I want to interview there's quite a few prominent Sugihara survivors in the States. So in May of 2019, I went across. Nobuki was giving a talk and being interviewed by a famous journalist at one of the Holocaust museums. And there were 300 of us survivors and descendants in the audience, which was quite incredible. It sort of felt like the Emil Sherman movie that's on at the moment, One Life, with Nicholas Winton. It was in an audience of all these people that owe this guy their lives, except Chiune was no longer alive. So when I went up to introduce myself to Nobuki, and subsequent to that, I met him in a restaurant and I interviewed him for 2 or 3 hours. I said to him, my first instinct was, can I give you a hug? Because you're the closest thing to your father. And I think that was quite a common phenomenon. And he's quite reserved because he's Japanese, but of course he allowed me to give him a hug. And it was quite an emotional experience. And interviewing him was amazing because I said, look, I'm writing a movie. I didn't know I was writing the book at the time as well, but I really want to know the man behind the hero. This guy is pedestaled and held up as an example of goodness and righteousness, but what was he like? What was the real guy? what was he like as a father. And so he gave me some incredible insight, and we've stayed friends and in contact, for since then. He has read the book. He sent me a photo with a big smile on his face. So that was, that made it pretty real for me.
It's nice to just hear, just even before we even dive into the book, it's just nice to hear that this book made him happy.
Yeah. I wanted it to be as faithful as possible to reality, because I realised, speaking to him, that he was telling me there's a lot of misinformation on the web. And so I think he just wanted it to be as accurate as possible. So when I discussed that with the publisher as well, we formulated this idea of weaving through in a parallel narrative the true story of Sugihara. And there's about 16 pages in the book which are italicized and really show his life fairly faithfully. So I also was very careful to run everything past Mabuki to make sure he was happy with the content and that it was faithful to his father's life.
You're just hot off the launch, and now I'm going to hit you with the chance to pitch it. What is The Star on the Grave about?
The Star on the Grave essentially is about a coming of age, a journey to closure for a young 21-year-old, Rachel Margol, who doesn't understand where she fits in the world. She's an only child. She has a very small family that she doesn't quite understand where the rest of them are. She's lost her mother at age 9, and she's very disconnected from her father. Her father seems to carry some unknown trauma, and she's extremely close to her grandmother. And she becomes engaged to a Greek Orthodox man, and that sets off a whole chain of events. Her grandmother, who is traumatized from losing everyone in the Holocaust, realizes she needs to reveal to this girl. They've hidden her Jewish faith and Jewish heritage from her in order to protect her from persecution, because they were fleeing persecution. They didn't know what it was going to be like in a new country, and they were so paranoid and petrified that they concealed it, and they thought they'd better assimilate and just become Australian and forget the past. That was a big mistake. She gets very angered by this, and then discovers inadvertently at the same time that this Japanese man had saved their lives, and there's to be a reunion in Japan. And so she decides she wants to go with her grandmother to find out why this man did this thing for 6,000 strangers that he'd never met, to learn about her Jewish heritage.
Nailed it. And again, this is I dissected a lot from this book. Maybe it was also pulling from my own family history, but also just pulling from this story that I just didn't know anything about and found it incredibly compelling. It's a story about its families, but also how the past defines families. It's about trauma, but also I got a sense of a conflict with the present. How much do you, as a family, do you let the traumas of the past affect you? And when I say present, I mean in context, because the book is set in 1968 as well as 1940. But it's also a book about resilience and the spirit of endurance.
Yes, it is.
And that trauma element of it, I think, I found myself particularly gravitating towards for the setting and the context you put it in 1968, because obviously that trauma at the time it's not like how it is now, where we sit 80 years away from it plus.
No.
It was much more omnipresent because the war had only just ended. It was still very much in the public consciousness. Yes. Tell me a bit about that.
So when I look back on my family's history and what they had to endure and how they came here in 1941 and left everybody behind, and by the age of 17 or 18, for me, my family had put it all behind, gotten on with their lives. They had to start earning a living in a new country. They had to make friends or, reconnect with old friends, because there were a lot of Holocaust survivors here. And so they were in little pockets in the community. All the Poles stuck together, all the Hungarians stuck together. And really they concentrated on bringing up a family as best they could, earning a living and integrating into a new society. So they put the trauma away, but the trauma never went away. And that's what Steven Spielberg realised when a lot of them started getting into their 70s and 80s and started talking, and he understood he'd better document this. And so he did the series called The Shoah, where he started interviewing and collecting data on the survivors and all their testimonies, because they realised their own mortality and thought, if I don't speak now, I'll never speak, and the world needs to know what we went through. So it just started coming to the fore really in the 90s. And I guess that's why I never heard anything from my grandmother, and I only heard it from my father when he was a senior citizen as well.
It's so interesting to dissect, but also through the lens of this character of Rachel that you have crafted. At the time when we find her, she's, finding her feet. Her life is coming together. She's a nurse. She is buoyed. I think I loved the relationship that she had with her grandmother. It was one of the real joys about the book, even though they go through a lot of challenges together, particularly as more and more revelations come through about the family. As you mentioned, she becomes engaged to an Orthodox Greek, and then that revelation about her being Jewish and her Jewish history. Tell me about crafting first of all, these two characters of Rachel and her grandmother, but also the journey to Japan and the places it took you when you were writing it.
So I've been to Japan in the 80s and I found it quite extraordinary. There was a movie that really resonated with me called Lost in Translation. That was a heavy influence on the way I wanted the tone of the movie to be. And so when I was thinking about that, the tranquility and the beauty of Japan, but also their recent history and their trauma in Hiroshima, I started researching that and realised there's an enormous connection between Holocaust survivors and the Hiroshima survivors and any survivors of genocide or that kind of trauma. So it was a universal theme. So I thought, that's great. I'm definitely going to put that in there. Also, the grandmother, I didn't have to do much, put it that way. She is the embodiment of my grandmother. My grandmother was a larger-than-life, hilarious character who couldn't pronounce things properly, who lived and breathed for me and my siblings. I've written me as an only child, but I've got two siblings. We were her everything, and she wrote herself. I mean, she just fell out of my pen onto the page. It was so easy. I did have a very close relationship with her as well, so that was quite easy. Writing the Rachel character was a little harder because I was not brought up Christian. I was brought up Jewish, and I had to create an entire story there, an entire character. I did, obviously, my character informed on Rachel's character, elements of her are me. I wasn't a nurse, but I was going to study medicine, but went the creative field instead. I am a painter. She's a painter. So hopefully I've written her quite faithfully. And I spoke to a few people who didn't know that they were Jewish for the same reason. Their parents had concealed it for fear of persecution in their new homeland and told me, yes, you've really nailed that. That's pretty much how we found out, just by default. And it's exactly how we felt, completely betrayed. And then they didn't know where to belong. And so they needed to also go on a journey of, where do I belong? Do I want to stay in this sort of Christian world that I wasn't really part of, or do I want to discover my Judaism and embrace it? And most of them did.
Well, I will say, because I mean, I am not surprised at all that you kind of added a lot of autobiographical elements to the story, and for someone who is not familiar with you, the world felt very lived in. It felt there was a lot of dimension. I feel like if I went down to have a coffee with the grandmother, I could just see more of the layers just peeling back there, which just because of the way that you translated the story there. But it's a question I needed to ask, because I often find when you touch on real world topics in writing, it's very difficult, because trying to do representations of those particular things justice, even more so when you discuss actual people. And you mentioned it a bit earlier, but because you have this parallel story of Chiune's story running through it, which was a real story, running parallel. I just couldn't imagine the responsibility you felt making sure that this story was told with you told this story justice, and but you're also doing it for yourself and your own family. How difficult? How difficult are we talking here? Was it to actually translate this to the page in such a way where you have his son smiling and beaming? That's hard.
It's very hard.
That sounds hard to me.
Well, it's hard, but because it was easy in that I knew what the basic story was and the historical facts. I just needed to run them past Nobuki for clarification that that's what they were, and he would correct me occasionally and say, no, that bit you've read is not right, that bit is right. And then having spoken to Nobuki and just getting the nitty-gritty of what his father was really like just as a dad. He told me incredible things, like his father couldn't find meaningful work because the Japanese government had dismissed him without reason, but the unwritten reason was obviously he disobeyed the Japanese government. He'd asked them 3 times for permission to write visas for these Jews fleeing persecution, and on 3 occasions they said, under no circumstances are you to issue these visas. So he took it upon himself to do it anyway because it was the right thing to do, which was an incredible risk when you're an ally of Germany who are trying to wipe out an entire race of people. So it's an incredible story in that he went back, couldn't find work. He's a highly intelligent man who needed to bring up a young family and was proficient in Russian. So he went and lived in Russia for 20 years away from his family, and as Nobuki tells me, only came back once a year for a week and just sent money home. So that's amazing. Little things like that I think people don't really know, except that I've gotten inside Nobuki's head. And he was a very caring human being. He gave me instances of, he remembers how his father used to spread butter on toast very thickly because he knew he loved it that way, walking on the beach with his father, going to little curio shops to get things with his father. He was just an ordinary guy. Not really, because this guy had a very strong moral compass and had disobeyed authority on many occasions during his life. And when readers read the story of, the things he did, it's quite surprising, but it's no surprise that he did what he did because he was a risk taker and he followed an extremely strong moral compass. But he really was just an ordinary guy that did an extraordinary thing.
This actually probably is a good segue to a kind of your story of actual journey to publication, because you've touched on it quite a bit, because you've had to straddle many different types and like you've had to look at the history, you've had to also craft these characters and put them all together. What was the journey to publication like? Was there anything particularly with this book, was there anything that really surprised you while you were making this book and crafting this story with a firm? Yeah,
extraordinary. I took my characters, as it were, to therapy. There's a friend of mine.
Oh, yes.
Yes, who's a therapist whose specialisation is childhood trauma and trauma in general. And I just ran everything past her to make sure I was writing faithfully. And as I was writing, especially my grandmother, the Felker character, I started talking about little traits that she had that I dismissed. We just used to laugh them off. She was OCD. She was a neatness freak. And then it just went like a light bulb one day, ding, oh my God. And so I said to the therapist, she used to tie her underwear and lingerie up with pink ribbons and have them in these little neat piles in her wardrobe, and nothing could be out of place. She'd notice one strand of a rug and she'd put it back. She couldn't stand anything out of order. Is that because her mind was so disordered because of the trauma that her outside world had to stay ordered in order for her to function? And she said, yes, you've nailed it. So little things that I started writing authentically just informed me on why my father, why my grandmother were the way they were. And that was really eye-opening. Unfortunately, too late in life, but that's what happens.
Yeah, and I just love that from this you've then built this story up. You've kind of done the back and forth as well with the firm crafting this book. And also, I just want to touch on something you mentioned earlier. You also want to translate it to the screen.
Yeah.
And I believe that is still something you're aiming to do as well at some point. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, very much so. It started as a screenplay because I'm an advertising copywriter by profession. And so I thought, I always wanted to write something significant. And I thought, well, I can entertain in a 1-minute TV commercial. This can't be so hard. Was I wrong? So I started writing every book on how to write a movie. I read everything. And then I was mentored by a lovely gentleman who is a very prominent screenwriter. And I started using him as a script editor and tried to do this myself and realized I just can't do this by myself. So I was getting his assistance, and so we became very good friends. And so it was real collaboration. So when you say that I developed it with a firm, I did. Their editors were just outstanding. But I had done years of work on the backstory, on the character arcs, on the whole thing with this gentleman and another young guy. The three of us had regular sessions collaborating when they weren't busy with their full-time jobs. And then I would go away and write and, try and do another draft. In the meantime, I managed to get, with a lot of work, a grant from Screen Australia and from Screen New South Wales to help develop the screenplay. But then COVID hit. And someone said to me, you are never going to get a movie up. Why don't you write the book? And my co-writer said, yeah, you can write. You're a good writer. Why don't you just write a book? So I did. It was lockdown and I had nothing to do. So I spent about 4 months literally vomiting something out onto the page. Ended up being told, well, now you need a literary editor. And I went, oh, what's that? So I found a fantastic girl, Alison Fraser, who was my lifesaver, and read the manuscript and said, oh, this is a wonderful story, but it reads like a well-crafted screenplay, not a novel. Let me teach you how to write a novel. So I employed her. It went back and forward, and she said, no, tell, don't show. You're showing, not telling, because, I was giving directions for a cinematographer and a director to show all the stuff that was in the characters' heads. I then had to take all that and write that on the page in great detail. So it was an amazing learning curve, but I loved every minute of it. And then she said, okay, I think we're ready now to approach publishers. And so I approached quite a few. I got a lot of knockbacks, and it was soul-destroying after all this, 8 or 9 years of work. And then a firm said, this is really interesting, and we're prepared to go on the journey with you.
That's fantastic.
They changed my life.
Yeah, it's absolutely insane, and I love that it sounded like when the first time that Alison looked at it that she went, yeah, it comes across like a well-crafted screenplay.
Because it did. It was very heavy on dialogue and not much else.
So do you actually have a final script now, or is it just...
I have a script, but so it's open to interpretation now because a couple of people have read it, and now we're waiting also to see. I have a producer in Hollywood who's ready to shop it round, but there's been such hype around the book Even Screen Australia said you may find that you get a lot of offers to option the book. And so it's kind of a blank canvas again in that, there are many ways to paint a painting and there are many ways to adapt a novel into a screenplay. So I think we're just waiting to see what happens and what the hype is and take it from there. But yeah, hopefully the movie is going to happen. It won't happen overnight, but it will happen.
Well, I will say that, the same thing happened with Schindler's Ark and Tom Keneally. It was the same story. The book came out after he met Pfefferberg, and then it ended up on Steven Spielberg's lap. And I would not be surprised if we see talks about a movie happening after this book comes out.
Well, I hope so. And Tom Keneally's given me a lovely endorsement. He's a real gentleman. So that's a great selling point too. Yeah.
He is lovely, isn't he? He always has so many great stories that comes out of him. I got to chat with him when I think it was the Dickens Boy, when he released the Dickens Boy. He came to us and signed a whole bunch of copies when I was working at Booktopia. And I could listen to him chat forever. He
does love to chat, but he's so entertaining and so interesting.
Will you write again? Obviously we've got this script here, so that's kind of going to be on your plate for a while. But has writing this book galvanized something in you? Would you write another story?
I would. Funnily enough, as I was writing it, I got all excited. I've planted a few seeds in there because as I was writing, I thought, oh, gosh, I've got a great idea for a sequel. And the prequel is kind of sitting in my bottom drawer because it's how I started the screenplay, the whole backstory. So that's kind of half-baked. So I guess it just depends on what happens with this. If it's successful and I'm coerced into doing something else and people want to know what happens next or what happened before, then I will. It also depends on my lovely children and whether they want to start procreating, and I'm, going to go into grandmother mode. So this family is very important too, so I'll have to create a balance. But I guess time will tell.
Well, whatever happens next, I'm so glad that we at least have this amazing story. And thank you for just introducing me to this amazing man. Thank you.
Thank you.
I love it. And I'm very glad that I know that Chiune now exists and that this can be the story that I can tell that other people can find out about. And I really hope that the book does well.
Thank you. I think it's a really important message at this time in the world. It's a pretty shaky world at the moment, and he just demonstrates the power of one person to go against the crowd, to think for himself, not be a sheep and follow others, do what is morally correct to make it a better world.
We finish our podcasts with a whole bunch of quickfire questions. So I just fling some questions at you, both about the book, both not, even about some of your reading habits. And you just give me the first answer that comes to your head.
Mm-hmm.
So first up, what is your favourite book that you've read in the last 12 months?
I'm halfway through Pip Williams' The Dictionary of Lost Words, and I'm loving that.
Oh, it's so good, isn't it?
So beautifully crafted.
Yeah.
But I haven't got to the end yet. I'm only halfway through, so I can't really comment on that, but I think that's a great read. Oh, gosh. Oh, you put me on the spot. I'm trying to think of things that resonate with me from my years and years. I love Isabel Allende. I love, classics. To Kill a Mockingbird. Just the most beautiful.
Yes.
And a very similar theme. Snow Falling on Cedars from years ago really resonated with me. Oh, gosh. Memoirs of a Geisha. I don't know. So many different things. Yeah.
You've almost nearly answered my next question, because I was going to ask you what is your favourite debut novel that you've ever read, but you've already just dropped Pip Williams in there, and then of course just casually To Kill a Mockingbird, which is my personal favourite debut. So a book so good it took It took 50 years for us to get a sequel.
Yes.
Is there a particular favourite debut book, aside from those ones that you've gone like, blew my mind?
Oh, man. Funnily enough, I'm not an avid reader of fiction. I've been reading so much non-fiction and factual stuff for years and years now because of my research. I haven't really had much time to read fiction, even on holidays and stuff. It's just I've gravitated towards, Eddie Jaku, The Happiest Man on Earth, because it's Holocaust related, which again is just such a beautiful and uplifting story. And my late mother knew him. He actually lived next to her in the nursing home, the room next door. An incredible human being. That is a debut novel. That was probably his only novel. Yeah, I can't think of any others offhand.
What an impression. That book was amazing. So beautiful. Such a beautiful book. Great pick. Yeah, I'll happily take Eddie Jaku for that.
Yeah.
What is the meaning of life?
Wow. What is the meaning of life? Family. Family is the meaning of life. I think family is the one thing that I go back to always. No matter how, I don't know how successful I will be. It's not about success. It's about being happy from within and not needing any external influences to make you happy. But it always goes back to family.
Love it. Love it. Do you have a favourite word?
Gratitude.
That's a good word.
For the age I'm at the moment, we have to be grateful for every day, but also just when you get thrown curveballs, which you invariably do, and more the older you get, you've just got to sit there and take note and say, I'm really grateful for the things that I do have.
If there is one, obviously this book, again, this trip to Japan that takes place in Japan, if there is one place that you would recommend to anyone listening that you should go in Japan, where would you go?
I haven't been to Hiroshima yet, but I believe it's quite an incredible place. But I have been to Kyoto, and it's absolutely beautiful. It's spiritual. It's probably the essence of Japan and how Japan was before technology went crazy. It's just spiritual, yeah.
Yeah. Final question. I feel like you've already kind of answered it at the beginning when you were talking about your experiences with the Nabuki, but if you could speak face-to-face with Chiune Sugihara, what would you say?
Right now, I would say, what do you think would be your advice to me on how to turn people's perception? What is it within you that made you see right from wrong and do what you did, and how can you influence others to do what you did? Because there are so many people that are uninformed about things going on in the world and choose the wrong path. What is that one little magic ingredient that you would think would turn them to think the way that you do?
That's a great answer. I love that.
There were only about 1,500 individuals, I believe, that have been given the title Righteous Among the Nations by the Israeli Holocaust Museum, Yad Vashem, for risking their lives to save Jewish souls. And tens of millions turned their backs or were complicit. And why? Why weren't there more people out there doing what he did? So, yeah.
I think this is a great spot to end our chat, but I finally just want to say thank you so much, Linda. Everyone listening, please go and get yourself a copy of The Star on the Grave. It's a story that you should definitely check out. Thank you so much, Linda. It has been a pleasure chatting to you.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure chatting to you. It's been wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of Date with a Debut and for listening to the Words and Nerds channel. You can buy all books mentioned in today's episode down in the description box, and if you enjoyed the show or indeed any episode of Words and Nerds, drop us a review, leave us 5 stars or a thumbs up. It is hugely appreciated. Catch you soon.